It was one of those quiet nights on the road, cutting across the wide, open desert. The sky was clear, stars scattered everywhere, and the landscape was empty, stretching out into darkness on either side of the highway. There was something peaceful, but also eerie about that kind of solitude. I was driving along when I noticed a strange glow in the distance, off the road to my right. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe lights from another vehicle, but as I kept going, I realized there was nothing else out there. No towns, no other cars, just those lights, floating, almost dancing across the desert floor. Curiosity got the better of me, so I slowed down to get a better look. These weren't headlights or any kind of regular light. They were round, glowing orbs, almost like little fireballs, but with an unnatural pale blue color. They drifted back and forth, just out of reach, like they were hovering above the ground. I pulled my truck off the road and watched, mesmerized. The orbs didn't follow any logical pattern, just seemed to drift and dance, moving together in this eerie, hypnotic way. I felt a chill run through me as I sat there, and for some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were aware of me, almost as if they knew I was watching. Suddenly, one of the lights broke off from the group and drifted closer to me. I felt my heart racing as it moved toward my truck, stopping just a few yards away. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter and dimmer like it was breathing. I can't explain why. But in that moment, I felt this overwhelming urge to drive away, to put as much distance as possible between me and those lights. I hit the gas and pulled back onto the road, keeping my eyes on the mirrors. The lights drifted back into the desert, but as I drove away, I saw them following me at a distance, like they weren't ready to let me go just yet. I didn't stop again until I was miles away, finally out of the desert, but those ghostly orbs stayed with me. Even now, every time I drive through that stretch of desert, I feel a chill, wondering if the lights will show up again, waiting in the darkness, ready to follow me once more. They say some places hold on to memories, echoes of the past that linger long after we're gone, and maybe, just maybe, those lights are part of something we're not meant to understand. The Shadow Passenger. I'd been pushing through a long haul, one of those nights where exhaustion sneaks up on you and you barely realize how tired you are until you're fighting to keep your eyes open. I'd been driving for hours, and the road was empty, quiet, with just the rumble of my engine and the distant hum of tires on asphalt. At one point, I pulled over at a rest stop to catch some sleep. I parked, leaned my seat back, and closed my eyes, just letting the exhaustion take over. I don't know how long I was out, but something made me wake up. There was this strange feeling in the cab, like I wasn't alone. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and as I looked over at the passenger seat, I froze. There was a figure sitting there, a shadowy silhouette, dark and indistinct, just barely visible in the dim light filtering in from outside. I could feel my heart pounding as I stared at it, every nerve on edge. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there as if it had been waiting for me to wake up. I couldn't see a face, but I had this unnerving feeling that it was looking right at me, watching. For a long moment, I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Finally, I forced myself to look away, blink, and when I looked back, the figure was gone. I tried to tell myself it was just exhaustion, my mind playing tricks on me, but that feeling of being watched didn't go away. I started up the truck and got back on the road, determined to put as much distance as possible between me and that rest stop. But the whole way, I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was still there, right beside me, just out of sight. Every so often, I'd glance over at the passenger seat, expecting to see that shadowy figure again, but it was empty. Still, that feeling of being watched clung to me for the rest of the drive. Even after I reached my destination and got out of the truck, it lingered. Since that night, I can't bring myself to sleep in my cab without checking the passenger seat first. And every once in a while, when I'm alone on those long, empty highways, I still get that prickling feeling at the back of my neck, like there's someone sitting beside me, watching. I'd been driving the same route for years and had become pretty familiar with the usual stops and the regulars you'd see along the way. There was this one rest stop in particular, a small, worn-down place with just a few lights in the parking lot and a coffee machine that barely worked. I used to pull in there sometimes, either to catch some sleep or grab a cup of lukewarm coffee to keep me going. One night, I pulled in to grab a short break. It was late, probably around 3 a.m., and the place was almost empty except for one other truck parked off to the side. I noticed the driver right away, a middle-aged guy with a worn cap leaning against his truck and staring out at the road like he was waiting for someone. I gave him a nod as I walked over, and he just gave a tired wave in return. He looked worn out, his face lined and his eyes heavy, like he'd been out there waiting for a long, long time. After grabbing my coffee, I walked back out and decided to chat with him for a bit. He introduced himself as Charlie, said he'd been on the road for decades, and that he was just waiting for one last ride. "Gotta make one more trip," he said with this strange, sad smile. He didn't offer any more details, and something about his voice made me think it was better not to ask. He mentioned places he'd driven through, familiar highways and towns, but every so often he'd say something odd, like mentioning a rest stop that hadn't been open for years or talking about a diner that had closed down back in the 80s. I figured he was just tired, memories blending together, but it gave me a strange feeling. I sat with him for a while, just listening to him talk about the road, and then finally he looked over at me, eyes distant, and said, "It's a lonely life, isn't it?" I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. I could tell he meant it in a way that went beyond just the job. Eventually, I told him I had to get going, and he nodded, giving me a small wave. He stayed right where he was, leaning against his truck, still watching the road. I climbed back into my cab and drove off, watching him disappear in my rearview mirror. A couple of weeks later, I pulled into the same rest stop again, and out of curiosity, I asked one of the attendants if they knew Charlie. The attendant gave me this strange look and said, "There haven't been any other trucks here for days." I was sure I'd seen him, sure he'd been there that night. But the attendant went on, saying, "Oh, you mean the guy in the cap? Yeah. Locals say he's been here a long time, waiting for his last ride. But if you saw him, well, maybe it was him. Or maybe you just saw his ghost. They say he never left this place." I felt a chill run down my spine as I got back into my truck. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror as I drove away, half expecting to see Charlie there, still leaning against his truck, waiting. Ever since, every time I pass by that rest stop, I can't help but look to see if he's there, waiting for that last journey. And sometimes, late at night on the road, I still feel that heaviness he left in the air, the weight of all those miles, all those lonely nights. Voices on the CB radio. It was late, maybe around 2 a.m., and I was driving through a desolate stretch of road, the kind where you rarely see another set of headlights for miles. The night was quiet, almost eerily so, and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional crackle of my CB radio. After hours on the road, I was starting to get that sleepy, heavy feeling. I turned up the volume on the CB, hoping for some chatter to keep me alert. That's when the static started to pick up, louder than usual, like someone was adjusting the mic on the other end. I figured another trucker was nearby, maybe just tuning in. But then, through the static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint, crackling voice came through, whispering, "Help! Please! Can anyone hear me?" The voice sounded distant, almost hollow, and it had this desperate, pleading tone. I immediately picked up my CB and responded, "This is Big Rig 17. Who's out there? What's your location?" There was silence for a moment, just the low hum of static. I waited, thinking maybe they'd cut out. But then the voice returned, more frantic this time. "I'm stuck. I need help. If anyone's there." My mind started racing. Whoever it was sounded like they were in serious trouble. Maybe they'd broken down or had an accident somewhere nearby. I asked again, trying to stay calm, "Where are you? Are you hurt?" But this time, the voice didn't respond with a location. Instead, it just repeated in this tired, fading voice, "It's so cold, so dark. Been here for so long." Something about that chilled me to the bone. This didn't sound like someone who was simply stranded. There was this unnatural, hopeless tone in his voice, like he'd given up long ago. And yet he kept repeating that he was waiting for help, as if he'd been out there for years, still hoping someone would find him. At this point, I was starting to feel a strange sense of dread, and I couldn't explain why. But I kept trying to reach him, hoping to get more information. "Stay calm. I'm going to find you. What's the nearest mile marker? Can you see any landmarks?" There was another stretch of silence. Then his voice came back, softer this time, almost like he was drifting off. "Mile marker. 23. It's so cold." My heart sank. I was pretty familiar with the route I was on, and I knew mile marker 23 was on an old part of the highway that had been shut down years ago. There hadn't been any traffic on that stretch since a massive accident had closed it down. Despite the eerie feeling clawing at me, I decided I'd drive up as close as I could to mile marker 23. The road was desolate, the kind of quiet that eats away at you the longer you stay in it. My CB was still on, and every few minutes I'd hear a crackle and then his voice, whispering, pleading, "Please, don't leave me. Don't leave me alone out here." Finally, I reached as close as I could get to mile marker 23 before the road closure. I stopped my truck, shining my headlights as far down the abandoned stretch as I could, but all I saw was darkness. I grabbed my flashlight, half considering stepping out to search further, but something held me back. There was a heaviness in the air, a feeling that whatever was out there wasn't meant to be found. Then, through the static, I heard it again. But this time, the voice was faint, fading, like he was drifting away. "Thank you for coming. I thought someone might come." And then, just like that, silence. I called out a few more times, but there was no answer. Just an empty, eerie quiet on the other end of the CB. Eventually, I gave up, feeling this strange sadness mixed with relief. The next morning, I asked some old-timer truckers about it, and a few of them just shook their heads. One guy told me about a trucker who'd crashed and passed away on that stretch years back, still calling for help even when there was no one to hear him. Some say that on quiet nights, his voice still echoes on the CB, hoping someone will finally reach him. Now, whenever I'm out on the road alone late at night, I keep the CB turned down low. Because once you hear a voice like that, a voice that shouldn't be there, you don't forget it, and you never know if it might call out to you again, still waiting for help on a lonely, unmarked road. Unmarked roads and lost time. I was on a long haul through the back roads, the kind of route that GPS sometimes struggles with. It was around dusk, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon. I was tired, but figured I could handle a few more hours of driving before calling it a night. That's when I saw a narrow, unmarked road branching off to the right, and my GPS directed me to take it. At first, I thought nothing of it. It looked like a shortcut, and I'd taken plenty of unmarked roads before. The pavement was cracked, and the trees on either side leaned in close, casting long shadows over the road. As I drove further, the surroundings started to feel off. The trees were dense, making it darker than it should have been, and I felt as if the road was narrowing, almost closing in around me. A couple of minutes passed, but something was strange. I didn't seem to be getting any closer to the main highway. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, and the GPS had stopped updating. It was like I was in some kind of dead zone. I started to get this uneasy feeling in my gut, like I was going in circles. Every turn looked exactly the same, and the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. It had to be a trick of the mind, I told myself, just my own fatigue playing games. But the uneasy feeling only grew, and that's when I noticed the clock on my dashboard had stopped. It read 7:42 p.m., the same time it had shown when I first took the turn. I glanced at my watch. It also read 7:42. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Time wasn't moving. My heart started racing as I gripped the wheel tighter, pushing the truck to go faster. I just wanted to get out of there. But no matter how fast I drove, the road just kept stretching on, unchanging, like I was stuck in some loop. That's when I saw the figure. Out of nowhere, a man appeared on the side of the road, standing completely still. He was dressed in an old-fashioned coat, the kind that looked decades out of date, and his face was pale and blank. He didn't move as I drove past him, didn't even turn his head. It was like he was a statue, frozen in time. But as I looked in my rearview mirror, I saw him again, further down the road, standing exactly the same way, staring blankly ahead. I thought I was losing my mind. My skin crawled, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow keeping me there, like he was part of whatever trap I'd fallen into. Desperately, I pressed on, trying not to look back, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the road finally opened up into an intersection. My GPS came back to life, snapping me back to reality, and the clock on my dashboard resumed ticking forward as if nothing had happened. I checked my watch. It was now 11:37 p.m. Somehow, almost 4 hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. When I finally reached a rest stop, I got out of the truck to catch my breath. I asked a couple of locals about the road I'd taken, describing the unmarked path and the figure I'd seen. They just looked at each other, then back at me with a kind of wary expression. "That road doesn't exist," one of them said quietly. "At least not anymore. There was a road like that years back, but it was shut down after a bad accident. The man who died there was never found. Only his car, abandoned on the road. Since then, I've never trusted an unmarked road the same way. Because out there, in the places beyond GPS and cell service, it's not just easy to get lost. You might lose something else, something you can't ever get back." The Woman in White. It was just past midnight, and I was driving down a quiet stretch of highway, that kind of lonely road with barely any lights and miles of dark forest on either side. I'd been driving all evening, so I was pretty tired but determined to push through and reach my destination by morning. The highway was completely empty, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional chirp of my phone's GPS. I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour, which is why I was so startled when, in the distance, I saw a faint figure at the edge of my headlights. As I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was standing by the side of the road, dressed in this long, flowing white gown that looked old-fashioned, like something out of another time. Her hair hung loose over her shoulders, and she seemed to be staring off into the darkness. I slowed down, thinking maybe she needed help. After all, it's not every day you see someone alone on a deserted highway at night. I pulled over and rolled down my window, calling out, "Ma'am, are you all right?" But she didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, her face turned slightly away from me. Something about her was unsettling, like she was lost or empty. I thought maybe she hadn't heard me, so I called out again, "Are you okay? Do you need a ride somewhere?" This time she turned to look at me, And that's when I felt my stomach drop. Her face was pale, almost gray in the dim light. And her eyes, they looked hollow, lifeless. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Just this soft, almost sad expression, like she was pleading with me. For a moment, I considered getting out of the car to see if she needed help, but something deep inside told me not to. Every instinct was screaming at me to stay in the truck, to get away. And then, just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she turned and started walking back toward the trees, fading out of my headlights. I felt this overwhelming sense of dread, like I'd just witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. As I sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, I glanced in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, right behind my truck, watching me with that same empty expression. My heart was pounding. I'd seen her walk toward the trees, so how could she be standing there directly behind me? Without thinking twice, I threw the truck into drive and sped off, my pulse racing. I didn't dare look back, but even as I picked up speed, I could swear I felt eyes on me, like she was still watching from somewhere in the dark. I drove like that for a good 5 or 10 miles, refusing to slow down, my eyes glued to the road. Finally, when I'd convinced myself that she was gone, I eased up a bit, taking a few deep breaths to steady my nerves. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light or exhaustion getting the best of me. But when I stopped at a gas station later, the clerk, an older man who'd clearly been working there for years, took one look at me and asked if I was all right. I told him about the woman I'd seen, trying to laugh it off as just a strange encounter. He didn't laugh. Instead, his face grew serious, and he nodded slowly. "You're not the first to see her," he said, his voice low. "They say she's been wandering that road for years, looking for help. Some say she died there in an accident and doesn't know she's gone. Others say she's searching for someone or waiting for something that never came." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, thanked him, and got back on the road. But that night stayed with me. Even now, when I'm driving late at night on a lonely road, I find myself glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see that woman in white standing behind me, watching with those hollow, lifeless eyes. Because when you've seen something like that, you realize that not every passenger you meet on the road is truly alive. The Rest Stop Ghost. It was late, probably close to 2 a.m., and I was driving through the middle of nowhere on a long-haul route. The miles had started to blur together, and I knew I needed a break. Finally, I spotted a sign for a rest stop just a mile ahead. I pulled in, and immediately the place gave off a strange vibe. It was completely deserted, just a row of dimly lit streetlights barely illuminating the lot, casting these long, eerie shadows that stretched across the pavement. I parked and got out, the cold air hitting me as I took a deep breath. The quiet was almost deafening. Not a single car in sight, no hum of engines, just the rustling of leaves and the faint buzz from one of the flickering lights overhead. I told myself it was just a quick stop. I'd use the restroom, grab a coffee from the vending machine, and get back on the road. As I walked toward the building, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing near the entrance, a woman, or at least I thought it was. She had her back turned to me, long hair falling over her shoulders, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned coat. It struck me as odd, but maybe she was just a traveler like me, stretching her legs or taking a break. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing as I got closer. I was only a few feet away when I called out a polite, "Evening." She didn't respond. She didn't even move. Just stood there, absolutely still. It was like she hadn't even heard me. Feeling a chill crawl up my spine, I hesitated for a second, then brushed it off. Maybe she was lost in thought or something. I pushed past her into the restroom, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something was wrong. Her presence was off. I was washing my hands when I heard footsteps, light, almost shuffling like someone walking slowly. I figured she must have decided to come inside, but when I stepped out into the hall, the place was empty. There was no sign of her, not by the entrance, not anywhere in sight. I glanced around, my heartbeat quickening. Then I noticed something even stranger. I could still feel her there. It's hard to explain, but it felt like there was someone just out of my line of vision, standing in the shadows watching me. The air felt colder, and there was this faint smell, like flowers but old and musty. I hurried back toward my truck, wanting nothing more than to leave that place behind. But as I reached the door, I saw her again. She was back near the entrance, standing perfectly still in that same spot, her head turned slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face. And that's when I froze. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, they didn't look alive. They looked hollow, distant, like she was staring right through me. A shiver ran down my spine, and every instinct told me to leave. I scrambled into my truck, fired up the engine, and pulled out of that lot as fast as I could. As I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror one last time, and I swear, for a brief second, I saw her standing there at the edge of the lot, watching me go, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared in the dark. To this day, I don't know who or what she was, but I've heard stories since then. People say that Rest Stop is haunted, that a woman lost her life there years ago, and she's been seen wandering ever since, always alone, waiting for something, or maybe someone, that never came. Now, whenever I'm on a long, lonely drive, I think about her, and I avoid rest stops late at night. Because sometimes, you don't know what, or who, you might encounter in the dark. The Highway Stalker. It was a long, dark stretch of highway, one of those nights when everything just feels off. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make good time to my next drop-off, when I first noticed the car in my rearview mirror. It was a small, beat-up sedan. Looked like an older model with a faded paint job and a single flickering headlight. At first, I didn't think much of it. Highway driving, you see other cars all the time. But this one just stuck there, tailing me closely, no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. Even when I switched lanes, it followed right behind, keeping a consistent, eerie distance. After about 20 minutes of this, I started to get annoyed. I thought maybe it was just someone trying to draft my truck to save gas, which is annoying, but not that unusual. So I sped up a little more, hoping they'd either pass or drop back. But the car didn't change its pace. It stayed right behind me, almost like it was glued to my bumper. I decided to test it. I switched lanes, drifted into the slow lane, and dropped my speed to a crawl. Sure enough, the car slowed down too, matching my speed exactly. It was like it was mirroring me. That's when the annoyance turned to something colder, something a lot closer to fear. I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe it was someone lost on the highway, someone just trying to find their way by following the only other vehicle out here. But the highway was straight and easy to navigate, and the longer I thought about it, the less sense it made. Why were they tailing me like that? Finally, after what felt like ages, I saw an exit ramp up ahead. I decided to take it and pull over just to see if they'd keep following or finally pass by. I signaled, turned onto the ramp, and watched in the rearview mirror, hoping to see them continue down the road. But no, they followed me. As I rolled down the exit ramp, I could feel my pulse racing. This was beyond strange now. I pulled off to the shoulder as I reached the end of the ramp, threw on my hazards, and waited. I figured that if they were really following me, they'd have to pass by, and maybe I'd get a look at who was inside. The car pulled over too, stopping just behind me. I peered into my side mirror, straining to see inside, but the windows were pitch black. There were no interior lights, no movement, nothing. It was like a car with no driver. At this point, I was thoroughly spooked. My brain was racing through possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of prank. Or maybe I was just imagining things after too many hours on the road. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The car just sat there, motionless, headlights still on, casting this faint, eerie glow over the empty road. Finally, I worked up the nerve to get out of my truck. I stepped down and took a few cautious steps toward the car, feeling the chill of the night air and something even colder, a gnawing dread. As I got closer, I realized the driver's seat was completely empty. The car's interior was dark and it was definitely vacant. My heart pounded as I stared, not quite believing what I was seeing. And then, as if it had a mind of its own, the car's engine roared to life. It reversed suddenly, backing up the ramp in a smooth, almost practiced motion, before turning back onto the highway and disappearing down the road. I stood there in the silence, watching it vanish into the distance, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know what that was, and I don't know who or what was driving that car. But I'll never forget that feeling of being watched, stalked by something I couldn't see or understand. Since that night, every time I'm on a dark, lonely stretch of road, I find myself checking my mirrors a little more than usual. I'll never forget that empty car that seemed to follow me everywhere, almost like it was waiting for something or someone. The Phantom Hitchhiker. It was around 3 a.m. when I found myself on one of those long, lonely stretches of Utah highway, the kind that seems endless, especially in the dead of night. There was no one else on the road, just me, my truck, and the quiet hum of the engine breaking the silence. Every now and then, a reflective road sign would flicker as my headlights passed over it, but otherwise, it was just empty highway and darkness. Then, I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, thumb out, looking right at my truck as I approached. My stomach did this weird flip because hitchhikers aren't something you see much anymore, let alone out here in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. But there she was, clear as day under a dim streetlight, looking a bit out of place, like she didn't quite belong in this era. She was dressed in this long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, her face hidden in shadows. I didn't want to stop. My instincts were screaming that it was a bad idea, but something about her made me tap the brakes and pull over beside her. Rolling down the passenger window, I asked, "Need a ride?" She just nodded, not saying a word. But her eyes met mine, and there was something in her stare that felt off, like she was looking through me instead of at me. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and she climbed in, silent as a shadow. The temperature in the truck dropped almost immediately, like someone had opened a freezer door. I tried to shake it off, figuring it was the cold night air or just nerves. So I tried to make small talk, hoping to ease the tension. "Where you headed?" I asked, but she didn't respond. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, hands folded neatly in her lap, like she hadn't even heard me. I tried again, a bit louder this time. "I'm headed toward Salt Lake. It's a long haul tonight." Nothing. At that point, the hairs on my arms started to stand up. I glanced over and she hadn't moved an inch. She looked almost statuesque, her face still in shadow. That chill in the cab hadn't lifted, and I could feel my heart starting to race. Then, out of nowhere, the engine seemed to sputter, like it was struggling to keep up. I gave it more gas, and as I did, I stole another glance her way. My heart nearly stopped. The passenger seat was empty. She was gone. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. My hands were shaking as I looked around, but the cab was empty. I checked the door, still locked. The seat belt was neatly tucked in place. There was no sign of her anywhere. I got out of the truck and looked up and down the highway. There was nothing but empty road in both directions. No footsteps, no trace of anyone having been there. The chill was still there, though, lingering in the cab, as if some part of her presence hadn't fully left. I sat back down in the driver's seat, trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. Maybe it was a trick of the mind, just a weird hallucination from too many hours on the road. But I knew what I saw. She was real. She'd been right there. Eventually, I forced myself to keep driving, glancing over at the passenger seat every few minutes, half expecting her to reappear. When I finally made it to a rest stop hours later, I shared the story with a couple of other truckers who were parked there, hoping they'd have some explanation. Instead, they looked at me with this mix of disbelief and knowing. One of them even said he'd heard stories about a phantom hitchhiker on that exact stretch of road, a ghostly woman people pick up who just disappears into thin air. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I've never taken that stretch of highway the same way since. Every time I pass that spot, I find myself gripping the wheel a little tighter, wondering if I'll see her again, waiting there by the roadside looking for her next ride.